Hey everyone, this is Sean. Today we're going to be learning how to add a scroll to top button to our website. Let's take a look at the example website I have here. If we scroll down a little bit, you'll see this button pops up here, and when we click it, we'll scroll right back to the top and the button disappears. I've put in a few test settings here to enable the button, enable smooth scrolling. Let's see what that one looks like, and disable that. When I click it now, instead it just jumps to the top. So we'll learn how to do that as well. Let me enable that real quick. And I also have a few other simple adjustments here, like changing the color or position. So let's learn how to make that. So let's go into our theme that we're going to be editing. Go to Actions, Edit Code. From there, we're going to create a new section, and let's call that Scroll to Top and Button. And we've got the default settings created for us. Let's also add this section we've created to our theme.liquid file. So we'll go here, and I'm going to go right above my footer here, and I'm going to, just copy this here, paste it here, and the name of the section we created, scroll to top button, let me copy that, and that's going to go right there so that it renders within our theme editor. We can refresh our theme that we're working on, and that new section we created is right there. Right now it's defaulted to section name because we haven't given this name yet, but we'll go and do that right now. So let's go back into our scroll to top button.liquid file. We'll give ourselves some room, and we're going to create a button and give it the text back to top. Let's give it an ID of back to top button. And we're also going to give it a title attribute for accessibility. So when you hover over this button, this certain text will appear. So we'll have it say, go back to the top of the screen. And we'll save that. We're good to go. The rest is going to be controlled with our CSS and JavaScript. So below our button, let's add some opening and closing style tags. And within that, we'll add some properties to our HTML. And the one we're going to be adding is called scroll behavior. And we're going to give it a value of smooth. And what this will do is, instead of when we click the button, instead of just jumping back to the top, it'll have a nice smooth scrolling effect. So let's save that. Next, we'll add some styling to our actual button. So let's call the ID back to top button. Copy that. And some of the properties we'll add. Initially, we don't want the button to display at all until the user scrolls down. So we'll set the display property to none. Let's set the position to fixed. And I want it to be about, let's say, 20 pixels from the bottom of the screen. And let's also give it a z-index of 99 just to make sure nothing goes in front of this button. This will have a pretty high priority in terms of z-index. Font size, let's give it 18 pixels. Border of none. Let's do outline of none. And border radius. Let's give it some nice rounded edges, 4 pixels. Background color, let's just start with a nice green. Let's give the text a color of white. And when the user hovers over it with their mouse, I want to make sure the cursor is always a pointer. And let's just add some nice padding there so it's not too tight. And we'll save that. I'm also going to add some classes to determine the positioning of the back to top button. If you remember from the example, I had a drop down where the user could select whether they want the button to be in the bottom left, bottom center, or bottom right. So let's add those classes here. So bottom left. And in terms of the position of the bottom left, we want it to be about 30 pixels from the left edge of the screen. Let me copy this class I've created here, and let's go give the next one the name of bottom center, and this one here is going to be bottom right. And the bottom right one is instead going to be 30 pixels from the right edge, and this one's going to be left. We're going to do 50%, and we're also going to transform its position to make sure it is in fact centered. So this will be translate x and then negative 50%. Save that, and we're good to go. So by default, I actually like the button to be centered. So this class we created here, bottom center, we're going to add a class up here and give it that name. So bottom center. And just for fun, stylistically, I'm going to add a nice hover effect for the button. So let's get that ID again here. Paste it down here, and we're going to add a hover. And when these are hovers, I want the background color to be, let's change it to lime green and save that. So next we'll add our JavaScript. So let's add our opening and closing script tags. And what I'm going to do is just paste in what I had already written. It's not too long, but just to save some time, we'll go through each line individually, and I'll also have this in the description below. So I'll paste that in, and let's go through it. So I've wrapped everything in a functional expression and assigned it to the variable back to top function. And within that, I've assigned our element of our button, back to top button, to the variable back to top button. And I've also added an event listener so that when the user clicks the button, the back to top function is run. And the back to top function is right here. And that simply says that when this function is run, let's scroll all the way to the top. And I have these two properties here because certain ones work for certain browsers, so it's good to cover all of our bases. If we go back up here, we have our window.onScroll, and that runs whenever the user is scrolling, and it works on your computer or your mobile device. So whenever a user scrolls, this function, scroll function, is executed, and that's the function right here. So function.scroll, function scroll function. If we are 20 pixels away from the top, or it says the same thing again if we're 20 pixels away from the top. And again, these two properties right here are to cover our bases because they work for certain browsers, but they do the same thing. So if one or the other, if we're scrolling from the top 20 pixels, then display our button. So set the display property of our button, which right now we have set to none, set the display property to block. Otherwise, set the display to none, so hide the button. And then down below, we actually call our function so that it runs on page load. There's this last bit of code right here that's specific to Shopify, and what it tells Shopify to do is by default, when we're in here editing our theme and we're messing around, we click the save button up here, and the page doesn't really do a full reload. It'll reload our CSS and things like that, but then our JavaScript is kind of broken. So this tells it to also reload the JavaScript without us having to manually refresh the page ourselves. And so this is nice for when your client is wanting to make sure things are actually working and they don't have to do an extra step. Adding this little bit of code here tells Shopify to not only reload CSS when our theme is saved, but also to reload this JavaScript function so everything's run correctly. So the last thing we need to do is to add our schema. So let's give our schema a name of scroll to top button. And within our settings brackets, let's give ourselves a little bit of room and give ourselves an opening and closing curly bracket. And we're going to first add a checkbox. I'm going to just paste this in here and we'll walk through it. So I've created a checkbox and I've given it the ID of back to top button enabled. By default, I've set it to true, and I've given it some verbose text so that when the user sees it on the front end, they know what this checkbox does. So let's reference this ID up in our HTML by doing if section.settings.back to top button enabled. And then end if. So if true, if the checkbox is ticked, then we want this to show. Otherwise, this won't show at all. So let's refresh our theme and take a look at what that looks like. So by default, we had it enabled. Now if we uncheck it, we can see that it's working and not displaying at all. Let's check it again, and there it is, it's back again. Awesome. Let's create another checkbox. I'm gonna just paste what I have here, and don't forget your comma, otherwise things won't work properly. And again, this will be a checkbox, and let's give it an ID of smooth scroll enabled. I'm going to paste that in here. By default, I want it to be true, and what this will do is if it is checked, if you remember from our example, sometimes if it's not styled into the website you're currently viewing, scrolling back to the top will just jump instead of having a smooth scrolling effect. And some users might like that. So we're going to give our user the option to enable or disable that smooth scrolling effect. So let's go back up to our CSS where we're actually controlling that. And we're actually just going to do another if statement. So if section.settings.smooth scroll enable, and then end if. Save that. Let's reload our theme and take a look. So right now it's enabled. If we click the button, it smoothly scrolls back to the top. Let's disable the button. Now if we click, it just jumps. Let's enable it one more time because I do love the smooth scrolling effect. So let's add one more fun property that the client can adjust, and we'll give it a type of color. And let's give it an ID of button color. Almost had a typo up here. And by default, can't forget your quotation marks and things like that, and colons. By default, let's set it to a lightish gray. So there. And the last one, let's give it a label so that the user knows what this button actually controls. Button color. And don't want to forget, this is all to be wrapped within curly brackets. So save that. Good. And now we actually need to call it. And remember, we're in our section.settings. So we're going to be doing up here where we have our color. So instead of just saying green, we're going to be doing section.settings.button color. Save that. Let's go back to our theme and refresh it. And now we have a color selector, and it's already taken effect, our color. So we can adjust it here to be nice red, and it's red. Awesome. So we're going to add one more essential setting that we want to give our client, and that's going to be our drop-down selector, where the client can select where they want the button to actually appear, whether it's in the bottom left, bottom center, or bottom right. So to do that, add a comma here, give ourselves our opening and closing curly brackets, and I'm just going to paste in what I had already written here, and we'll walk through it, just save some time. So here we have a type of select, and that is just our drop-down selector. I've given it an ID of back to top button position, and the client will see the label back to top button position. And the options within that drop-down selector are going to be a bottom left, bottom center, and bottom right. And I've given them values bottom left, bottom center, bottom right with dashes in between. And you'll notice that these names are actually the same as our CSS that we created up here, because we're going to be using those to assign our classes based on the drop-down that is selected. So if we go back up to our class here, we manually set bottom center, but instead here we're going to call that setting we created section.settings.back to top button position, and save that. So now when the user selects one of those drop downs, it'll assign whatever class we have selected and assign the relevant CSS we created as well. Let's refresh our theme. And now when we click bottom left, we see it in the bottom left. Same thing, bottom center, and bottom right. Awesome. So that wraps up our scroll to top button that we created. I know I went through some of the sections a bit quicker this time, especially the schema section of our file. So if you need a bit more in-depth explanation of how this section works, check out my past video where we created a custom announcement bar. Additionally, we've only given our client the ability to add and adjust color and disable or enable the smooth scrolling effect. But there's a bunch of settings you can give your client. So I'm curious to see what you guys come up with. Let me know in the comments what you guys think. Until then, I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye.